good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And good morning, Scott Kozin. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Rebecca Shirley, and welcome to the Stoke Mandeville Educational Series, which is endorsed by Plaster and Icoplast. And today we're joined from Philadelphia by Scott Kozin. Scott is Chief of Staff at Shriners Hospital for Children in Philadelphia. I had a wonderful time there in 2016 when I went to learn about tetraplegia and many other things. Amazing time at the Barnes Foundation with Scott's wife, so very fond memories of that indeed. I've asked Scott today to talk about his experience with the Touching Hands project, which is endorsed by the American Association of Surgery of the Hand. And he's going to talk about that shortly. If there are any questions, it would be great if you could put them through the Q&A. I should have asked you actually, are you happy if we record this and put it on YouTube? Scott?
Not a problem, no problem.
That would be great, thank you very much. All right, well, I'm going to pass over to you and your talk.
Okay, let's try this again. Are we good?
Very good, yeah.
Okay. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody across the pond. Rebecca and I were reminiscing about her visit in 2016 during the last presidential election, and times have certainly changed. And I can tell you from the heart, we miss our friends across the pond badly. And with the reference to the Touching Hands project, it's been a difficult year because the missions have not occurred. But there's been a lot of other work. We've worked really hard on establishing actually electronic medical record. We've worked really hard on establishing some outcome measures, which we can probably talk about in the discussion. And we worked really hard on standardizing what we feel is necessary to make a mission successful. But what I'm going to talk about today is, in essence, how this project got started. And the title of the talk is the Touching Hands Project, Inception to Implementation. And it has a lot to do with being in the right place at the right time and having the opportunity to accomplish what we call is a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. And for the Hand Society and for the community, that's what the Touching Hands Project has been. So this talk is more of a story about what happened beginning in 2014 and how this project has become so successful with reference to the number of volunteers that participate, the monies that's been raised, and the overall goals of the mission itself. So it started when I was president of the American Society for Surgery of the Hand, and I clearly didn't have a dream like Martin Luther King did in 1963 for the Civil Rights Movement. But I had a similar dream that I proposed to the membership, and I challenged the membership to get involved in volunteerism. Now, at that time, there were a lot of people performing volunteer work, just like many of the people in this talk today, but there was no umbrella organization to unify this attempt and effort to really make a difference. So we had been doing volunteer work since the early 90s, but it wasn't until 2014 that we started this Touching Hands, and I'll tell you the story about it. So in 2014, I took the reins from Ed Ackerman. Ed is the other bald guy pictured here on the left. And there I am on the right. And what I said to the membership during my presidential address was that I had a dream. It may have been a lesser dream than Martin Luther King, but it really was a dream. And I equated the world to a cleft hand, as you see pictured here. So there's a clinical picture and an x-ray. And what I said is the world is like a cleft hand, with a large divide between those that have access to hand care and those that don't have access to hand care. And I said to our members that we're the surgeons and we are the therapists who can close the cleft, and we can have a hand in fixing the divide. So we can take an operation like a cleft hand and we can close the divide, and we could do a similar thing. And why should we do it? Oh, I think we could make the world slightly a better place. I think it's a little bit of a corny explanation, but it is really what it's about. And then in essence, I sat back and watched how the membership responded. And to this day, fast forward 6 years later, the response has been overwhelming. The response has been breathtaking, and the response has led to a successful outreach pillar for the American Society for Surgery of the Hand. So the other question is, why should people pursue volunteering? I get asked this all the time, and I think it's an important concept for those young surgeons who are listening to the talk. It does enrich your life. It's a huge impact in my life. And during this COVID pandemic, it's one of the things I miss the most. I miss being in other countries, visiting other people, and helping other children. It's helped me professionally, put things in better perspective. It's helped my family. And this is my daughter, Samantha, on one of our numerous missions to Guatemala. And I think we have made a difference. And now there's data to suggest we've made a difference in multiple ways. The other part about volunteering, it's a little bit like carpe diem. You are in it with the rest of the group. And I always tell people that I may not remember what year I was in what country, but there's always some memorable and influential experience during any particular mission that I remember, and I can remember it vividly. Now, here back in Philadelphia, I can barely remember what I did yesterday, but there's something about mission work that puts you in the moment. That's such a valuable thing, because everybody is there for a singular goal, and that's to help the people and help the country and help the persons that you interact with during that mission work. So, for example, I can remember this child in Guatemala in 2012 who was left abandoned and brought in by a nun who had adopted the child. And as you can see, his very little upper extremity function, but his lower extremity function is impressive. And all of us were impacted by this child in 2012. And if you talk about anybody who was on the mission in 2012, they say, oh, you remember that child, that CP kid who couldn't use his hands but could use his feet and could feed himself. And that's the type of the memories that you'll have when you participate in mission work. Again, whether it's 2012, 2010, 2014, it doesn't make a difference. What makes a difference is the memory of this particular child and the memory of that event. Now, the other important question, and this is all about timing. So in 2014, we challenged the membership. In 2016, the Lancet Commission on Global Surgery came out with some really, really important facts about surgical missions. And they said a few things. First and foremost, universal access to safe, affordable surgical and anesthesia care, which is equally as important, can save lives, prevent disability, and promote economic growth. So prior to this, surgery was the ugly stepchild, and all the monies were going to HIV and malaria, which are all equally as important, but surgery is extremely important. What else did they say? 5 billion people lack access to basic surgical care. That is a lot of children and a lot of adults. And what's equally profound is there's about 250 million operations performed each year. And the world's poor receives only about 4% of those surgeries. And if you think about that number, it's just overwhelming. There are more than 95 children living with disability, and every 3 seconds, someone is severely burned. And a lot of our mission work, especially where they cook on open fires, are overwhelmed with burns. The perfect opportunity for hand surgeons and plastic surgeons to work together. And a lot of my experience with burns has been on volunteer work. I don't do nearly as much back in Philadelphia that I do when I'm away, and I learn from my colleagues. So another important point about volunteering. This fact is really interesting, actually. 11 to 15% of the world's disability is due to surgically treatable conditions. And injuries alone cause about 6 million deaths, way more than the 3.8 million deaths caused by malaria, HIV, AIDS, and tuberculosis combined. So what does all this mean? It means that surgical treatment can make a difference in resource-poor settings. And it's in level or in par with vaccination programs, and 10 to 15 more times valuable than antiretroviral medication for HIV. So we took information 2004.
We're struggling with the...
Because they are needed.
Scott, we lost you a little bit there with the internet. I wonder if you could just go back one slide.
Yeah, so just let me know if that happens, because it just came up. It usually happens afterwards. Like it just said my internet was unstable. So let me go back. Right here, Rebecca?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so
And,
we
and
got to the end of that one. Thank you.
all right, so you heard, let me just go through it. So if it happens again, just let me know. It's just been this global problem with reference to everybody using Zoom. But surgical treatment can make a difference, and it can be more effective than antiretroviral medication for HIV. So Touching Hands took this information and applied it to its mission. And we said that what we should do is we should train more surgeons and try to incentivize them to stay in underserved regions. So we now have an award, a fellowship, where surgeons from where we go come to the United States and spend some time here and then go back to their country. Surgical missions, we are continuing. There's a lot of controversy about whether it should be horizontal way to help healthcare or vertical way, and we'll get into this. But I do think surgical missions are paramount as long as you understand that you need to teach somebody on the ground to do some of the work that you do while you're in country. And strengthening national systems through sustainable global partnerships between surgeons, hospitals, and institutions has been THP's mission. What does that mean to me? It means once you find a collaborative partner in a particular country, you need to go back. And you need to go back and back and back and back. And that is what has hurt us in this COVID pandemic, because we can't go back to the countries that we've developed great relationships with over time, but we will be back. And I tell them all the same, we will be back. Now, why hand surgery or plastic surgery? Well, if you look in developing countries, there are still 3 million people that cook over open flames, and that leads to the burns that we discussed previously. In Cambodia, there's still a bunch of unexploded landmines, and this is Jim Chang, who will become an important part of the story, who was also president of Hand Society, who is a plastic surgeon, who is the chief medical officer for research, and we've worked hand in hand. If you're over in other countries, there's no OSHA, so the machinery is unprotected, as you see here. If you have experienced the violence of a machete, it is utterly overwhelming. And I always say the worst thing is a machete, a male, and alcohol. And that combination leads to really bad things. Because in an instant, a machete, which is extremely sharp, can not only injure a patient, but it can make them such that they can't work. And when you have this laceration across the palm, involving tendons, nerves, and arteries, that may be the last time this particular person can work with their hands. And then, of course, there are congenitals. And this is a child from Afghanistan that we saw. And what happened with her is we actually didn't operate her in Afghanistan. We had her brought back to the United States. And we'll talk a little bit about what we call the reverse commute. And I think it is important just to remember that we live in a world that's just not fair. And there's such a discrepancy between the have and the have-nots. And this is a child who had his arms cut off by his dad so that he could become a better beggar. And he was brought over to the United States. And when you hear something so horrific, it's so easy to say, oh my God, the dad's such a bad person, which he may be. But if you think about it in another way, what would make a father do this to their child? And that's just dire straits. So we took care of him at the shrine in Philadelphia, and he subsequently has stayed in the United States. So in the beginning, this is back to 2014, I thought if we could do one mission during 2014, so I could talk to the membership about one mission, that would be enough. Remember, when you're trying to do a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal, don't say you're going to do 20 missions in the first year. That's a mistake. Just start slow and then build a program. Whether you're building Touching Hands Project, or you're building a free tissue center, or you're building a transplant center, all those things need to start slow with low-hanging fruit. So our first mission was in 2014 to Haiti. Why Haiti? Incredibly poor country. Why Haiti? It's fairly easy to get to. And then why Haiti? Because we had connections in Haiti, which I'll talk about in 1 second. And this was the first mission. Now, when we picked the first mission, we picked people who had done volunteer work previously. Why? I didn't want to hear anybody complaining about the water being cold or the showers not working. I wanted all people who had experienced volunteer work. And this is the team. It's a very small team. It's surgeons. It's one fellow, Mike Nakashian, anesthesia, which is incredibly important, and then experienced as nurses like you see here. And we went in 2014, but if you remember, the horrible earthquake occurred in 2010. And it was amazing. And to this day, Haiti is one of the poorest countries I've ever seen. There's total lack of infrastructure. There's street markets. There's destitute people all over the place. And it was a little bit overwhelming, right, when we first got to Haiti. Now, once we got there, we also brought 700 pounds of supplies because they absolutely had no supplies whatsoever. And these were all donated by our corporate partners, which have become very important in this mission of touching hands to make it a successful mission. Here's my friend, Mark Barrett, who's an orthopedic surgeon in Pittsburgh. And I think Mark said it best. Something magical happens when a group of relative strangers gather for a selfless act, meaning volunteer work, in a community with great need and few resources, and that's Haiti. And egos have to be put aside, inconvenience are suffered like cold water. And with each step, the group gets stronger and stronger. And what's fascinating, we worked at the Adventist Hospital, and the motto was this: plant a seed, you reap a tree; teach someone to plant a tree, you reap a forest. The same analogy for teach a man to fish. We saw lots of different patients, lots of stuff that was from the earthquake itself. So there were a fair amount of amputations. This was a chemistry teacher who fell running away from the earthquake and sustained a scaphoid fracture and had advanced collapse of his wrist. Now, what's made Haiti a success has been this particular guy, Francis Alexis. He is a Haitian orthopedic surgeon. He is dedicated to the community, and he has helped us facilitate touching hands in Haiti. So one thing we have learned, you need a partner, and you need boots on the ground. And if you come in and out, without somebody there while you are not there, the project will not be a success. And we've gotten away from projects where it's just coming and operating and leaving without some form of teaching, without some form of community work, without some form of other volunteerism. These were the initial operating rooms. Pretty bad, pretty rustic, and we call them semi-sterile. On our first mission, and what we still like to do, it's 2 surgeons per case. I brought my favorite anesthesiologist, Harry Bonet, who's an expert in regional anesthesia, and here he is doing a regional block. We used headlights because those of us who've been on volunteer work know that the grid is often unstable, and whether you use headlights or whether you use your iPhone, you better be prepared because the lights often go out. Again, this is the standard pathology that we see in our current practice. This is a girl with a burn that we treated with syndactyl. We did half her syndactyl on this mission and the rest on the second mission. She's returned to school. Now, with reference to mission work, there's a couple other points I'd like to bring up. People are reticent to do mission work for a variety of reasons. One is they don't think they are talented enough, and that's never true. Everyone here and everyone on this call is talented to do something and to help in some way, shape, or form. The second is what we call the fear factor. They're afraid something bad is going to happen to them. They're afraid, for example, they may be hurt. Well, we don't let that happen. We travel as a group back and forth. We make sure there's ample protection for the group. And if the mission gets close to a spot that's uncomfortable, like recently there was a mission scheduled for Nicaragua that we canceled because it was political unrest, we just canceled the mission. We can't take the chance that someone's going to get hurt. And the third factor that people are concerned about is that they may get sick. They may get sick from eating something or drinking something, and that may happen. And most of us that have done volunteer work have been sick on more than one occasion. Occasionally had a parasite, which is good for my diet, but ultimately you're going to be okay and you'll be fine. But that's the 3 fear factors that we see. And then after each day, I think it's important to debrief. And when you debrief, just like you debrief where you huddle back at home after an operation that goes good or bad, it's important to discuss what went well and what did not go well, and then make appropriate adjustments. And then you get up and do it again. And I always think of the Jackson Browne song, but this is the group going back to Haiti. Now in Haiti, we also teach residents. Again, this is really important part of mission work. So the residents that we teach have grown over the years. And this is George Dyer, who's up in Boston, who's an excellent educator. And here's Mark Barrett giving an elbow talk. And then over time, you develop collegiality and friendship. Why? Because you go back and back and back and back. So imagine, this is 2014. This is all we did. All we did was this one mission, right? And then we moved into 2015. And the question is, do we have any momentum? I don't think we had any momentum. I think we were still trying to push up a hill, this project onto the membership. Because at that time, volunteer work was not what we call one of the pillars of the Hand Society. So the Hand Society pillars are as follows: research, education, patient care, and what we call the special sauce, which is operational excellence. And over time, we've now added the fifth pillar, which is now outreach. And outreach includes domestic outreach, and outreach includes international outreach. But not in 2015, we were nowhere close. So we added these missions here. We added one to Ruth Paz in Honduras. We started to work with research. Again, this brings back Jim Chang, who's the CMO for research and who's added a couple missions. It's been a great partnership. Ethiopia, we added, Trinidad and Tobago, and then we went back to Haiti because you have to go back. Now, one particular mission one particular spot that we go to, I want to mention is Ethiopia. And Ethiopia has really been what I call a match made in heaven. So if you look at Ethiopia, there are give or take 80 million people. And there are give or take no hand surgeons. Zero. There's not a single hand surgeon in the country of Ethiopia. There is tremendous need. And now we decided to approach Ethiopia different than other missions. There is a great group of pediatric orthopedic surgeons at the Cure Hospital in Addis. And we said, we're going to teach them how to do hand surgery. Hand surgery is really not much different than pediatric orthopedic surgery. And these guys are really good. So with this gentleman who's an expat named Rich Gardner, Duretti and I and a very small group of people have gone to Ethiopia for about the last 6 years. And we've trained these pediatric orthopedic surgeons to do hand surgery. Here's Freddie, who's an Ethiopian, and Mesfin, who's an Ethiopian. And both of them have done fellowships in Canada at sick kids. So they are experienced surgeons. And this has really been give a man a fish to feed him for a day, teach a man a fish to feed him for a lifetime. So now when we go to Ethiopia, they'll schedule a bunch of cases. Maybe they're Volkmann's ischemic contracture cases. So they'll schedule 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We'll do them all week. And then after we leave, they now have that operation under their belt. So they'll do a lot of secondary cases for brachial plexus. They do a lot of burns. We've now incorporated a plastic surgeon into the mix. So they're doing a lot of propeller flaps and pedicle flaps and rotational flaps, which are so needed in this country. So it's really been, I think, one of our prized places that we go because now we've made a difference when we're not there. Just an example how we change lives, and this is a child with a mirror hand on the left side. And it's interesting in some of these countries how they just believe this is a curse to the family. So these kids can't go to school, they can't participate with other kids, and they're just shunned by the peers and shunned by other families. And if you do an operation, like you see here, so there's 8 fingers here, we need to make it 4 fingers and a thumb. And here's the operation. And here's the immediate outcome. And here she is before we left in 2015. In 2016, we saw her again, and guess what? She's now in school and no longer rejected. And then here she is 3 years later with a pretty good use of her hand. Again, not normal, but clearly better than having 8 fingers. And that's the type of small change you can make. Now the group there, meaning Rick and Mesfin and Teddy, they're not comfortable enough to do an operation of this extreme, so they save these operations for us when we come. Just like Usman, this is one of the more challenging cases we did. Usman has raised a bunch of money for us because he's done so well over time, but this is a complex macrodactyly of the right hand, which is difficult for all of us to treat, as you see here. And then here is his outcome after pulsation of his long finger and removal of his thumb and index finger. Now, other collaborative missions that have really worked for us has been Guatemala Healing Hands. So Guatemala Healing Hands is a mission that goes to Guatemala every 18 months. Now, it started in 2004, so it started well before Touching Hands started. My friend Miguel Cruz, as you see here, started in 2004, and I started going in 2007. So again, well before Touching Hands ever got started, we were going to Guatemala. But now we have worked with Guatemala Healing Hands. And in terms of what the relationship has been, we provide some monies because we have a bunch of money now. We provide some support with reference to transportation and some support for the therapists. But it's a very different mission than Ethiopia, and it's very different than Haiti. So it's about team building first, There's a lot of medicine, there's a lot of teaching, a lot of community. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it. And again, this is my daughter here. Again, this has been extremely important in our relationship. She's now a social worker, and I think a lot of her work is related to her experience in volunteer work. Here are some fantastic surgeons, Barrett's again, Greenberg, and myself. What we've also done in our volunteer work as we've grown the project, it's very hard for somebody to come to the United States and operate with me. It's just hard from international. It's licensure, it's liability, it's really difficult. But yet, people who have visited me, like Francisco Soldado, pictured on the right, who practices in Barcelona, now goes with us to Guatemala and we get to operate together. What a fantastic experience. It's every time we're together, it's memorable. Now, the Guatemala Healing Hands also does other stuff. We spend time in the community. We bring a whole bunch of people. So the entire group is about 50 people, and about half the group is physician oriented and half the group works in the community. And we've helped build latrines, we've helped build stove, we've helped plant trees, we've done all sorts of work in the community, and we've adopted a community called Chichoy. We even built a school in Chichoy, and that's made a difference. And what I found from a volunteer work experience is that if you go into the country and you just operate and you work really hard for 6 days, you come back and you feel good, but it's like a quick week. If you go and at the same time you invest in the community, you may build a latrine, you may go to an orphanage, you may do other stuff, that relationship or those memories are even stronger. And the people that do all the stuff on a mission are more likely to go back because they've perceived more of a reward than just going and operating. So we have to be careful of just going into a country, burning through resources, burning through staff, and then coming back home, because that may be fulfilling once or twice, but it's not sustainable. So we've made this mission work more sustainable. Every time we go, there's a 2-day bilingual free education conference to healthcare specialists, which includes a lot of therapists and surgeons throughout the country. This particular mission is heavy on therapists because we work at a burn hospital. So of the 20 or 25 medical staff, probably half are therapists. And these are some of my favorite therapist friends. The other thing we do in Guatemala, which I would encourage everyone to consider, is when we do screeners, which is about 100, 120 patients on a Sunday, well, we see them together. If you're seeing patients individual, there's no learning. If you're seeing patients with your colleagues, you are learning as much as they are learning. So we try and do screeners together as much as we can. And then after we see patients on that Sunday, we operate their subsequent week, and there's tons of surgery, and there's always stuff to do. So this is 2015. So another important point that I've learned about making a BHAG successful is you need to go back to the people who are vested in the BHAG. So what we've done a lot of is every time we do missions in a given year, we bring the information back to the membership. So the membership needs to know that the monies that they've provided are going to good use. So this is what we gave to the Hand Society membership in 2015. And we're just telling the membership, thank you. And thank you from the heart. And thank you for what you've done and how you've supported the project. And it goes through each of the individual missions that we attended. And there's always some nice music with it and some nice commentary. And this is just a little glimpse of what we showed the membership in 2015. Because again, we were still trying to build momentum. This is 2015. We've only been in business 2 years, and we still hadn't garnered enough mission work, and we still had not nearly enough money because we need money to run these missions. And people don't like to talk about money. I have no trouble talking about money, whether it's Shriners Hospital for Children or whether it's Touching Hands. We need money to make this work, and we're going to talk about fundraising more toward the end of the talk. So now in 2016, I think we did start to develop some momentum. And if you look at the trips in 2016, it's these 5, and then we did, I think, a total of 9. So again, we're adding slowly, slowly, slowly. And as our budget increases, we can add more and more missions, right? So here's the 5 in 2016, and here's the rest of them in 2016. So by the end of 2016, we had 9 missions completed. We'd added Honduras, which has been a win-win, which I'll show you. We added World Pediatric Project to St. Vincent's Island, which failed. So not everything we do works. And then we went back to Ethiopia again and again. And Ethiopia has molded into this fantastic educational project. There's a huge hospital called the Black Lion. And now when we go to Ethiopia, we teach. So this is the first time we taught. We now do a cadaver lab for all the residents. It's one of those fascinating stories is the government decided that there was not enough orthopedic care in the country. So again, 80 million people, no hand surgeon. So the orthopedic residency was about 4 residents per year. They just made it 12 a year because there's no ACGME in Ethiopia. They can do whatever they want. So they just increased it to 12. The problem with increasing it to 12, they did not increase the number of ORs. They didn't increase the number of educators. So these residents are literally starving for information. So Rick Gardner has coordinated a cadaver course where we dissect cadavers with them, which is unbelievable. It's supported by the AO Foundation, actually. And then we now teach on a couple days, either before the mission or after the mission. And there's a lot of camaraderie, a lot of visitors. Now, just to show you that not everything works out like you want, the World Pediatric Project initially was a bust. So the World Pediatric Project is a very good non-governmental organization. They do a lot of spine surgery in St. Vincent's, and we thought we could do hand surgery in St. Vincent's because they're busy. And what happened was our first trip was 11 cases. That's not a win. That's not a big bang for your buck. They only saw 32 clinical patients. So what we did is we said to them, listen, we're going to pull back. You're going to have to get us more patients to get a bigger bang for our buck because we are the stewards of the monies that are given by our members and given by volunteers. We did go back one time and it was better. I'm not sure it's going to be a sustainable project for us. Now, Honduras has been fantastic, and Honduras has been run by Fraser Leverset, as you see here. The reason Honduras has been great has been buy-in from the country. So if you look at the lower left of the screen, this is an orphanage that we visit. There's a boys' orphanage and a girls' orphanage. The guy on the left is a guy named Chuy, or Jesus. Jesus is a billionaire. Jesus has taken an affinity to touching hands because of what it's doing in the community. He works in the free zone, in the trade-free zone, and he makes T-shirts, but he's a billionaire. So he has given us a bunch of money to come back to Honduras, and that's Julie Katarinzik on the right. And Fraser's brother is involved, Relton, who's depicted here, and this is us together on a mission. It has been extremely successful in terms of volume. The second time to Honduras, there were 51 cases, 121 patients, 14 volunteers, and a lot of procedures. So that's what's happened really on the international side. Now, what I want to add is what happened in 2016, which is just remarkable. So John Seiler, who's a really good friend of mine who works in Atlanta, was in his surgery center trying to promote touching hands. John works on the foundation side and said, what does anyone want to go on mission work? And everyone was like, of course we want to go, but we can't afford the time away from our practice. We can't afford the time from our families. And John said, well, what if we just did it in this surgery center? It was an incredible idea, actually, because before we were unable to solve licensure in the state because the states are weird about needing a license in each state, and we were unable to solve liability. And in one simple step, John Seiler solved it. Because what people who've not been to the States don't realize, regardless of your political belief, there are millions of people who are uninsured or underinsured. And they can't afford something simple like a carpal tunnel that can get them back to work. They can't do the CMC arthroplasty. They can't do any of that. And what happened was John solved it, right? He decided that in Atlanta, we were going to do our first, we call it domestic outreach because we had international outreach, and it was a huge success. So now we have taken that model of domestic outreach and applied it to different cities. So it's been in San Francisco, it's been in Atlanta, it's been in Philadelphia, it's been in Kansas City, it's been all over the country. And just for a day or two, the surgical centers are run by touching hands, everyone volunteers, and we get to care for citizens of the United States who are underinsured or just don't have any insurance. And the stories have been remarkable. So this has been, again, about being in the right place at the right time. But John Seiler deserves all this credit, not me, for solving this one particular issue of domestic outreach. Now, we've also expanded to what we call the reverse commute. And one thing about mission work that everyone needs to understand is there are certain cases you just cannot do in these countries. You don't have the resources. You may not even have the expertise at that particular mission. And we had to figure out some way to get those patients back to the United States so we could care for them. Fortunately for me, as Rebecca said, I work at Shriners Hospital for Children, which is a true charity, and they're willing to do things above and beyond the call of duty. And we've organized this reverse commute where we've worked with our non-governmental organizations to bring these kids over and house them, and then we provide their care. And the first one that we ever did was Chantel. And Chantel's story just typifies how we run the reverse commute. So she fell out of a tree, right, in Rwanda, and she was treated by the medicine man with salves, which is fairly common, actually. The bone was sticking out of the skin originally and became infected because it was sticking out of the skin. She then went to the big city where they took the infected bone out of her arm. They put it in the autoclave, and then they put it back in, and surprisingly, it popped back out. So Chantal became our first experience with reverse commute. And we didn't know how to do it back then. We're good at it now, but we didn't know. So we approached the Shriners Hospital for Children, and said, we want to try and bring this kid over. We need to do a particular operation that's very difficult. And we're going to also approach some of our NGOs, like Global Medical Relief Fund is the one we use the most. It's an organization that has a house in Staten Island outside New York City, and it houses the kids, it feeds the kids, and it provides transportation. And we've worked with about 200 kids with Global Medical Relief Fund, and they are a wonderful organization who also cares deeply for children. So we brought the kid with Shriners. This is my friend Scott Levin, who's the microsurgical expert. Here was Chantel's initial examination. Her neurovascular structures were fine. Her hand worked fine, but there was no stability to her humerus. So her humerus bone, which had popped out, was now no longer present. And you can see her arm being flippy-floppy. And here is her x-rays. And there's really only one way to solve the segmental bone loss, and that's a free fibula. So we opted to perform a free fibula, taking the fibula from the leg, as you see here, and then putting it into the arm. Now, this is not optimum fixation, as you know, but this is the best fixation we could obtain. And this is Chantel post-op, as you see here on the left side of the screen. And what you notice about Chantel is she really was a fan of the food in the United States, and she gained a lot of weight real quickly. Therefore, everything we had made for her prior to surgery to fit after surgery, nothing fit. So we had to refabricate everything. But here she is. And then here ultimately is her x-ray where it healed. And she stayed with us for about 6 months or so. And then she went back to Rwanda with a stable humerus and now ability to use your hand, because you need a stable shoulder joint to put your hand in space. And she has communicated with us from Rwanda. And we have a whole bunch of kids from Rwanda. Here she, a little bit of cockeyed video, but you get the message. And what's on the horizon? Well, there's plenty of kids that need our help from the reverse commute. There's your Betsy who needs a toe to hand, right? There's Lamrot that needs a similar operation as Chantel. And unfortunately, and this is a little bit political, it's become more and more difficult to bring these kids across the pond or across the globe. And politics, in our mind, politics have gotten in the way of us caring for these kids. Regardless of what you believe in politics, it's harder to get visas to come to the United States. It's harder to bring the parents in, and we've had a diminishing ability to care for these kids that we see with Touching Hands in other parts of the country. Now, are we making a difference? I think we are. Yeah, I'm hoping we are. We've clearly grown since 2014. In 2017, this is a little bit of an old slide, there were 17 missions, there were 4 domestic missions, there were 200 volunteers, there were about 500 free surgeries, and then the $300,000 in in-kind donations. I want to spend 1 second talking about in-kind donations. So we have pushed our corporate sponsors hard for donations. They can give money, which is absolutely fantastic. Some companies, especially the smaller ones, cannot give money. They don't have the money, but we've asked for in-kind donations, which are really important, because if we had to spend $300,000 on supplies, that would deplete our endowment, which I'll talk about next. So that money is extremely important. We make sure that they get our annual report. We make sure that they are recognized at our annual meeting, and we make sure that they understand what a big part they've had in this entire Touching Hands project. Now, in terms of money, in 2018, and a lot of this work goes to Jim Chang, we said that we needed to raise $5 million. Why $5 million? I'm not really sure why we came up with that number, but we can spend 5% of $5 million. That's what we figured, right? So you can spend $250,000 a year. And what people need to understand, that's all we can spend because it's an endowment, right? So we established an endowment and raised $5 million, and now we can spend $250,000. Jim Chang and I talk a lot about it now, and we think we're going to need more money once the pandemic ends to do more missions. And maybe we should have said we're going to raise $10 million. We should have said something else other than $5 million. But we have $5 million now, and we're able to spend $250,000. And to date, we've done 33 missions or so. We've treated thousands of patients. We've done tons of surgery. And we have continued to expand our domestic hand days to Atlanta, Cleveland, Colorado Springs, Dayton, and we're giving back to the local community as much as we're giving back to the international. And I think this resonates, especially with corporate America, that you can do both. Our vision is to do at least 10 to 12 international missions, at least 10 to 12 domestic missions, include corporate involvement, include both hand societies, the Hand Association and the Hand Society, and then we will make a difference, right? I mean, I think we will over time. We are committed to making a difference. Like I said in the beginning of the talk, during this COVID downtime, we're working on other projects such as electronic medical records, such as outcome measures, such as ways to make it more safe when we go to these particular missions. But I love to quote Bill McGee, and Bill McGee is the gentleman that started Operation Smile. And Bill McGee, we visited in 2014, and he has been an amazing mentor to me and a mentor to the Touching Hands Project. And he's got some great expressions. First and foremost, the world does not have enough caregivers. I totally believe him. Second, reasoning leads to conclusion, emotion leads to action, and outreach is emotional. And my favorite is the greatest bonds of friendship are forged during service to others. So during these difficult times for all of us, some days are better than others. When we're down about the COVID pandemic, I will frequently go into my photos of some of our volunteer efforts and call volunteer friends around the globe. And it does make a difference to me for sure. And everyone can be great because everyone can serve in some way. And last and not last, we make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. That's amazing. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Can I start by asking a question? Have you made use of any technology? There's a company in the UK, Proximy, that allows augmented reality to give remote communication during an operation. So say, for example, there's an operation that needs to happen promptly, but there's a surgeon who needs some guidance, which isn't available there on site. Have you been involved in anything like that?
Not in real time, actually. We've clearly been involved in surgical planning beforehand, but I think what you're referring to is real time.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we have not done it, but we will look into it. What's it called?
Well, the company that I'm familiar with, started by a British plastic surgeon, is called Proximy. And they've used it to give remote advice. So a surgeon with a level of competence, but who could do with somebody remotely pointing and directing surgery, has been used just to give extra support.
No, we have not used it.
Okay, so thank you. That's excellent. So we have one question from one of our delegates from Pakistan saying, how can they get involved? That's Nayeb Samir. How can we join?
So what they need to do is reach out to me, and then that's the first step. We have a vetting process because we've learned that if people simply send me an email, then that's the end of the conversation. But if they want to reach out to me, I'll put them through the vetting process. We have a plastic surgeon, actually, Don Lalonde, who is now our outreach director. And Don would vet the program, meaning, could we do it? Was there adequate support on the ground? Do people want to participate? It's a whole list of questions, but there is a applied vetting process that we now use.
Thank you. Okay, so this is a question from an anonymous attendee. Thank you for an inspirational talk. I'm quite junior in my training, therefore often feel I'm not skilled enough to get involved in these projects. Can you advise us on how we could be part of the team?
Right, so that's a very common question. Anonymous or not, that's an extremely common question, because young people probably aren't talented enough to run a mission by themselves. And what I tell all of them, they should go with an experienced surgeon. And they should understand that they may not be operating every single day. They may be watching, they may be helping. But if they go with somebody who's experienced, so for example, if for me, because I do congenital hand surgery, they would come with me. If they wanted to do burn surgery, they would go with a burn surgeon. So they need to volunteer and volunteer early. I think the other thing, Rebecca, that's important for the young people on the listening in is if you put volunteer work into your daily schedule or your yearly schedule early on your career, then you'll continue. So when I started in practice in the 1990s, I didn't feel confident at all to go on mission work and operate on people. I could barely operate on the people I was operating on. As my friend Dick Berger always says, I feel bad for the patients I operated on in the first 5 years of my practice, you know, as a joke, but I think that is true. So I felt that I just wasn't ready, but I did do volunteer work at what's called at the Ronald McDonald House here in Philadelphia early on, because if I put it into my schedule early on, then I thought it would continue. And then when I felt confident, which is probably, I've been in practice about 8 years, I went on my first mission alone, you know, able to operate. But I agree, do not put yourself in a position when you're operating over your head. And a lot of times there's pressure from the in-country to do something that you're comfortable with, not comfortable with, you just can't do it.
Question from me, do you have a different approach, say, with fracture fixation than you would have when you're in Philadelphia? Do you go for simpler methods sometimes? Is that an appropriate thing to do?
Yeah, so it's another great question. So I think the KISS principle, you know, keep it simple, stupid, does apply to some of your fracture fixation. What's fascinating about volunteer work, because I always wonder what happens when you're not there. Once the country realizes you're there, I'm not sure where all these people come from with broken bones acutely, but you're right, you have to simplify the operation, especially when it comes to the complex hardware, the expensive hardware that we use. It just may not be available. You know, be prepared to use mix maxing sets, be prepared to use a hand drill, which is always funny on occasion, and be prepared to use stuff from the hardware store that's been sterilized. But you have to simplify some of your fracture fixation for sure.
Thank you. Okay, here's a question from one of my friends. She's an orthopedic trainee. She's Shireen Ibish. She actually came over to the UK as a refugee from Syria, and she's now training in orthopedics. She says, fantastic work and very inspirational. How easy have you found it to involve local communities at the beginning? My experience is the biggest obstacle at times is locals being skeptical of foreigners coming in and wanting to do work to help out, especially in maintaining sustainability in the long run.
Yeah, another superb question. So I think you have to understand the political landscape of the country that you visit. And if the local community of orthopedic surgeons feels vulnerable to the group, it won't work. You have to somehow embrace them. So we don't actually run into it as much as you would think in some of the countries we do with our touching hands. But where we run into it a lot is actually we go to Puerto Rico 4 times a year, right? And the Puerto Rico orthopedic surgeons were very threatened by Shriners Hospital for Children coming down to visit and take care of their kids and to take the kids back to Philadelphia. And the way we solved it in Puerto Rico is they come to our clinic. Simply. So we engage them to come to our clinic when we'll see 3 or 4 Nerton kids in our clinic of 10 surgeons. And if something is within their wheelhouse and can stay in country, then we keep it in country. It's a great question. So for example, when I'm in clinic in Puerto Rico, there's a hand surgeon with me, a plastic hand surgeon. And if I see a kid with a simple syndactyly, or I see a kid with a trigger thumb, something relatively straightforward, I no longer bring them back to Philadelphia. I have them stay in country and have surgery with Dr. Debs. And that's one way, but I think the question goes even deeper, because if you go into a country and you don't know the politics, you can really get yourself in trouble. And I don't know, that's why you need to have somebody on the ground. And that's why you just can't go into Syria without knowing what's on the ground. Because if you make them mad or you piss the local community off, then they're going to push you out.
Thank you. So, question from Wee Lamb in Edinburgh. Hi Scott, great talk. What do you think are the most important lessons you learned doing this work? What can you implement back in the US?
Yeah, you know, Wee Lamb always has the hardest questions. Why is that? So I think that there is no doubt it is a two-way street, right? Meaning we bring things to the country that they implement, but we bring things back. And back to your question about fracture fixation, I think a lot of fractures that we treat in the United States in a complicated fashion can be treated in a very simple fashion. And I've learned a lot from my pediatric orthopedic surgeons in Ethiopia about Alizarov stuff, you know, lengthening in an easy way, about some of the fracture fixation they do, from some of the plastic surgeon there about soft tissue coverage, you know, how to make it easy rather than do something hard. I clearly do, honestly, I do less free flaps now than I did 10 years ago, because I've learned coverage in other fashion from the plastic surgeon there, mainly propeller flaps, rotational flaps, et cetera, et cetera. So there are clear, it's interesting. Everyone thinks it's a one-way street. This is, I think, Wee's point is everyone thinks you just take the information there, you deliver the information, and you make an impact, and then you come home. That's not the way it works at all, actually. And I always wonder, you know, who learns more? Do I learn more being with them and bringing it back, or vice versa? And I think sometimes it goes both ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. So here's a question from Abraham Nagusi, who is in Ethiopia. He's a plastic surgeon working more on hand surgery and needs more experience in congenital hands. He was trying to join your mission at Cure in Addis, and he wonders, when do you think will be the next trip?
Well, so we go every spring, and we're planning on going back in the spring. As long as things are safe, I mean, I'm praying, I'm sure like he is praying that we will be back in the spring, right? And then he's more than welcome to come spend the week with us. It's great.
Here is a question from James Chan. He is one of my colleagues at Stoke Mandeville. He's an inspiring surgeon, and he asked, what is the hardest thing you've had to overcome to set this thing up? How do you lead and enroll people, especially the naysayers?
Yeah, and one thing we haven't talked about, you know, there are a bunch of naysayers, you know, that people think we're just doing, you know, was it volunteer, whatever the derogatory term is. And I think there will be naysayers that you're not going to be able to convince, but I think there will be people on the fence that you can convince. And I think the way to convince the naysayers is to have them come on a trip, right? So another part of the trip has been, if one of our corporate sponsors, for example, wants to really sponsor a trip and give a bunch of money, I forget the amount, maybe it's $30,000 or $40,000, then we allow them to send one or two of their employees, right? And those employees will subsequently take the information back to their company, and then some of the naysayers change. I think they're not going to change because of me. They're going to change from other people on the missions who've had similar experience. The other, Rebecca, the other thing that we didn't talk about is that there are a bunch of people who are non-academic, private people who go on our mission work. One of the misconceptions is, oh, mission work's only for academic people. False. Private practice people have just as much talent and can be equally as committed to volunteer work as academic people. And they can be naysayers, but they can be converted to yaysayers.
What would be your response if you come up against someone you completely disagree with, say somebody that is trying to obstruct you from doing something that you believe is in someone's best interest?
You mean from a patient standpoint or from a program development standpoint?
From a patient standpoint and from a program development.
Yeah. So, we run into that, as you know, in our daily practice. And I think that goes back to what Rebecca mentioned in the very beginning. Leadership is a funny thing, right? And if you're responsible for your organization, whether it's Shriners Hospital or Touching Hands, you can try to convince the person to a point, and then ultimately you're going to have to step in. You just have to. The one thing about leadership is everyone's not going to be your friend, right? And that's just the way life is. And if you're going to lead and lead by example, you're going to have to make difficult decisions that are going to make people happy. Our motto is that the institution, whatever institution you work at, trumps any individual. And if you use that simple model, making a decision about what is right or wrong for a patient, so the institution trumps any individual, you're more than likely going to make the correct decision, and you're more than likely not going to make that person happy. But that's the way it has to be, right? And if they're putting a patient in harm's way, or they're making a decision that goes against the mission and vision of the organization, it's the wrong decision.
Okay, I've got a few more questions just before we wrap up. What are the main lessons that you have learned from this work?
And again, this sounds corny. The main lessons that I've learned, it has just made me a better person and physician. The mission work has, in itself, right? And if it wasn't part of my life, I wouldn't be as, whatever good means, as good as a leader, as good as a person, as good as a doctor. Wouldn't have as much empathy, which sounds kind of weird, but because I'm fairly empathetic, but I think it really has made a difference. And then the second point is, and this is a little bit of a bash about the United States, is that when you travel around and you see the have and the have-nots, that impacts you. And unfortunately, what we have in this country is a lot of people don't travel and don't go outside the borders and don't see what it's like. They are naysayers often, and they are very difficult to handle and to deal with. But I think that's part of it. We're lucky as surgeons. We can do some good because we're surgeons. And if you can travel around and see what other people do, that's a win. It's a win-win, actually.
What has been the most surprising thing for you about doing this work?
So from Touching Hands, the most surprising thing has been its success. And I really mean it. When we proposed it in 2014, because there are a lot of naysayers in our membership. There are a lot of people that think it's, volunteer tourism, and you don't make a difference. And we weren't sure what was going to happen in 2014. So the biggest surprise to me has truly been the success of the project. It's almost like you throw something out there and you wait and see what's going to happen. And the fact that this has happened has been the biggest surprise. I never, ever, ever imagined that we would have raised $5 million. We would have made it a pillar of the Hand Society, and we would have made it a sustainable project with an outreach director, Don Lalonde. I mean, that's amazing, actually.
Okay, so I'm going to finish just with one last question. What for you has been the most challenging aspect of this work?
Yeah, it's interesting. Everything seems to be challenging, but I no longer think that anything's insurmountable. Right? And I think if you just got to keep working at it. Sometimes you hear no, but you always wonder, is the no really a no, or is the no just a not yet? Right? And I think that's important. And I think there are ways to overcome not everything, but mostly everything. One thing I didn't mention that I should have mentioned with Don Lalonde that I've learned, I went with Don Lalonde on a mission, and I learned how to do Wallant surgery from Don Lalonde. So this is back to Wee Lamb's question, right? That is something that I brought back to my practice indirectly by doing mission work. Because if I hadn't been with Don and I hadn't seen Don set up this Wallant surgical room and operate on all these people that didn't have any money whatsoever, I never would have learned about it, right? So there's a classic example of bringing something back. And I can tell you what, Don Lalonde doesn't hear no either. He hears not yet.
So that's great. In fact, we've done a lot of Wallant since Don Lalonde's webinar, and in our hospital now we are doing so much in our minor operations room, all inspired by him and actually pushed forward by COVID. So it's really nice to draw those things together. I think lots of much deeper messages in this. And thank you ever so much for your time. It's been really inspiring. It's given us a lot to think about. I'm sure there would be a massive applause if you could hear everybody from around the world who is listening in. A lot of the participants, I can't see where everyone's from, but I get the impression that we have got a really good worldwide audience. So that's absolutely fantastic. Yeah, very grateful for your time. I'm going to just ask you a very quick one just while I've got you, but about tetraplegia, because that's the reason we first met. And I was very inspired by your examination of a tetraplegic in Newcastle. That's where I first came across you. But tetraplegia in the developing world, that's a challenging one. Have you any particular thoughts about that?
Yeah, so unfortunately, tetraplegia in the developing world often leads to a death. I mean, it sounds brutal, and it is brutal and it's painful, but if they can't care for their non-orthopedic issues, meaning their skin, meaning their urinary tract, they often get septic and they get die. The best thing you can do for tetraplegics is to educate them about their skin and educate them about, you got to prevent getting decubititis, that'll kill you, and you got to prevent getting a UTI. From an upper extremity standpoint, for me, it's just been tendon transfers. So there's been this whole push in tetraplegia for nerve transfers instead of tendon transfers. If I see a tetraplegic patient in a developing country, I go back to the KISS principle, and I'm going to do a tendon transfer and try and help them become more independent. Because it just simply creating pinch and grasp makes a huge difference. But the real problem, I think, is overcoming wheelchair skin issues. It's devastating in those countries, and most countries, actually.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much, Scott. It is lovely to catch up with you again. And thank you everyone else for joining us today. It's been a very inspiring talk. Really appreciate it.
Stay well, everyone.